There were independent studies, but virtually all of the independent studies, that is, studies which were not funded by the industry, virtually all of them did identify one type of problem or another with aspartame.
And so they got the test results they wanted by manipulating the method. This is not to say that aspartame was safe or that aspartame does not induce seizures, because it does. It's just to show you that the scientific data nowadays is unreliable.
So how you design the study is going to have an impact on the results. And I think that many of the industry-sponsored studies were set up in such a way that the results could be predicted ahead of time and would be supportive of the safety of the product.
Sounds great. We'll see you then. Thanks a lot. Bye-bye.
There is no evidence at the present time that I'm aware of that aspartame in large amounts has a significant effect on brain chemistry.
Can we go through what exactly an excitotoxin is?
Well, an excitotoxin, basically what it does, it's a normal transmitter in the brain. These are chemicals that allow brain cells to communicate. But if it's in even a minute overconcentration in the brain, it causes the brain cells to become extremely excited. And they become so excited, they'll very quickly burn themselves out and die. That was one of the first observations by Dr. Olney, and he gave it the name excitotoxin.
When was the first time that you heard about aspartame? Was it during that investigation with the FDA?
Yes, it was. It was in 1970, and it was an interesting story. I was called by Dr. John Olney from Washington University, who I had been working with on MSG and baby food. We had started an examination of MSG and baby food that led to the baby food industry taking MSG out of baby food. And it was done by the Senate Nutrition Committee. I was the special counsel to the Senate Select Committee on Nutrition. And we ran hearings on food, and one of the things we talked about was MSG in baby food, because it caused holes in the brains of rats that were being tested by Dr. Olney. And it was Dr. Olney's hypothesis that a substantial amount of mental retardation, 95% of which is of unknown origin, that a substantial portion of that came from environmental insults, chemicals in the environment, food, air, water, and so forth. And he was testing them. And one of them was MSG, and it caused these holes in the brains of mice in his system, and ultimately that led to having MSG taken out of baby food. He called me to say that he'd just done a study on aspartic acid, one of the primary components of NutraSweet, and it was doing the same thing as MSG. And that caused him to be quite concerned about the fact that Cyril Drug Company at the time was planning to use this as a sweetener.
But now, after years of retesting this, most authorities agree, there's no question, that feeding MSG to animals produces this brain damage. It's not questioned any longer, it's a fact. There's even good studies to show that if you feed the pregnant animals the MSG, their offspring has impaired brain function. And when you measure the neurochemical analysis of the brain of the animal, it's impaired all the way through the animal's youth up until adulthood, and they never quite recover from it.
In one of the conferences which I addressed for the FDA a few years back, there was a study with MSG, monosodium glutamate, which is another excitotoxin. It's a neurotoxin problem. And we could not understand why with the controls had almost the same number of reactions as the people had given it. But it turned out that one of the presumably inert components in these capsules of products with MSG contained aspartame. So it really was, there was something that even the investigators did not realize was a component of the presumed placebo.
The central mechanism that actually produces the destruction and damage to the brain is excitotoxicity. That's pretty well agreed upon now. The frightening thing is that we're adding tons of these excitotoxins to our food, either in the form of MSG or part of the aspartame molecule, which is aspartic acid, which is an excitotoxin.
Can we talk about the blood-brain barrier and how it breaks down? Like hypoglycemia can be an example of that, and how excitotoxins can pass through that on occasion.
Yeah, the blood-brain barrier is one of the big defenses that the industry always gives. They say, well, these things can't get through the blood-brain barrier. I did rather extensive research in this area, and what I discovered was that there are numerous conditions that we're all subjected to that cause the breakdown of the normal blood-brain barrier. Number one is aging. As we age, our blood-brain barrier begins to deteriorate. It becomes porous. So that anything we eat will pass through the blood into the brain. Alzheimer's disease, Parkinson's disease, all of these diseases are associated with the breakdown of the blood-brain barrier. Strokes, even silent strokes, produce a breakdown of the blood-brain barrier. Exposure to certain pesticides, herbicides will break down the blood-brain barrier. Hypoglycemia will break it down. Certain drugs will cause it to break down. Free radical generation will cause it to break down. Well, we know many of the diseases are caused by free radicals, like diabetes. You can have very high free radical levels. Extreme exercise, you produce a lot of free radicals. All of this breaks down the blood-brain barrier. Multiple sclerosis, autoimmune diseases, lupus, all these things are associated with the breakdown of the blood-brain barrier. So we know there are millions and millions of people out there who have, at one time or another, a very porous blood-brain barrier. So when they drink a Diet Cola or they eat MSG, it passes right into their brain very easily. The other thing that we discovered was that even if you had a completely normal, intact blood-brain barrier, if you expose that person to a high dose of these excitotoxins over a prolonged period of time, it will seep past the barrier into the brain.
The same building blocks that are found in all of the proteins that we eat, whether they be bananas or meat or peanuts or what have you, they are found in NutraSweet.
Now, the amino acids are contained in food, but if you have protein, meat, fish, and so forth, there may be 4% phenylalanine in the food, but not 50%. And we simply, biologically, don't know how to react to this flooding of these enormous amounts of amino acids in the body, especially the phenylalanine, which crosses the blood-brain barrier. It's meant to protect against, biologically, against poisons and so forth.
It's also what's called a dipeptide. That is, it is two amino acids stuck together. One of those amino acids is something called phenylalanine. Phenylalanine is the building block for another important neurotransmitter called norepinephrine. So when you take in aspartame, you'll increase the availability of one and you'll decrease the availability of the other. You'll change ratios. And when you do that, when you change ratios of norepinephrine and serotonin, you certainly affect brain function. And this can lead then to mood symptoms, to panic symptoms in some people. It'll affect seizure threshold, which is why I think I saw the seizure in this initial patient back in 1985, and why I saw a lot of seizure activity in people who were taking in a great deal of aspartame.
They knew that this product, aspartame, with time breaks down into a product called diketopiperazine. Diketopiperazine chemically is closely related to a carcinogenic compound that causes cancer in a lot of animals if they're exposed to it, and humans. So they asked the GD Searle Company to do a separate study with the diketopiperazine. Well, when they looked at this study, they found some shenanigans as well. And one of the things is when you mix up the diketopiperazine with the animal's food, you have to homogenize it so that it's evenly distributed and the animal can't see it and avoid it. Well, I've seen pictures of the feed, and they left it in big clumps so the rats were eating around it, not actually eating the diketopiperazine. There was also evidence that they were giving the diketopiperazine to the control animals. And of course, this came out because in the original study they found a 47-fold increase in brain tumors. In their diketopiperazine repeat study, they said, "Oh, well, look, the control animals and the aspartame-fed animals have the same incidence of brain tumors." Well, when the neuropathologist looked at it, said, "Well, that's kind of strange because now your control animals have a very high incidence of brain tumors that's not naturally found in these mice." And then when they looked at the feed, they found out there were some mix-ups of the feed so that the diketopiperazine was being fed to the control animals. These are the sort of things that's in the Bressler report that the makers of NutraSweet would not like the public to know about because it's very frightening. When the pathologist, Dr. Adrian Gross, looked at the material as well, very well-regarded pathologist, and he looked at it and he was absolutely shocked. He said it's just an enormous increase in tumors, particularly the brain tumors. And of course, that's exactly what we're seeing now is this tremendous increase in brain tumors in this country, which is completely unexplained by the neurological profession.
There is also a methyl group which is found in all fruits and vegetables. Everything that we eat has methyl groups.
When the body metabolizes, when it breaks down aspartame, you wind up with a small amount of methanol, which is wood alcohol. That in turn is broken down into formaldehyde, which the body cannot get rid of, the body stores. Now, the industry has made a big deal about supposedly the fact, it's not really a fact, but what they claim is that when you take in fruit, you take in more methanol. They don't add the fact that in nature, the methanol in fruit is bound to something called pectin. Humans lack the enzyme to split the methanol off from pectin, so it goes through the body without doing any damage whatsoever. The body doesn't get exposed to the methanol because it's bound to pectin. So even though there's more of it, it's totally harmless in fruit. But with aspartame, you have the pure, unadulterated, free methanol and then formaldehyde. It's a small amount, but the body can't get rid of it. It's a cumulative phenomenon. So we have very, very toxic products.
Methyl alcohol is just deadly and probably provides most of the poisoning attributed to ethyl alcohol and alcoholics. It is the deadly one.
Aside from the pectin story, in fruit, in nature, you also are taking in equal amounts of ethanol. You get both methanol and ethanol, and so they counteract each other. And so there's essentially no impact. You're not poisoning yourself when you take in fruit. I believe you're poisoning yourself when you take in aspartame.
Methyl alcohol, wood alcohol, has obligatory metabolism to formaldehyde. Formaldehyde, which is embalming fluid, is 5,000 times as potent a poison as is sipping alcohol.
The FDA, which is the watchdog of American safety that we have empowered to protect the American public against food additives and drugs, has repeatedly reviewed all of the data that has been forthcoming from hundreds of studies about aspartame.
Back in 1965, according to G.D. Searle, one of their researchers was working on an ulcer drug when he happened to get some of the substance on his finger, and instinctively he licked it, noticing its sweet taste. One of the first tests conducted on aspartame was a 52-week study of monkeys to determine the effects of aspartame on primates. 7 monkeys were fed aspartame with milk. 5 of those monkeys had grand mal seizures, and 1 died.
Monkeys have more of a reaction to ethanol, regular alcohol like vodka or scotch. They have a real high resistance to methanol, and even though they were fed aspartame with milk, they still came down with seizures, and one died of, I guess, cardiac arrest from overstimulated nervous system. Searle went back and got another physician, a fellow named Dr. Wellington, and this guy sat down and redesigned the monkey study.
In that same year, Dr. John Olney found that oral intake of aspartic acid could cause brain tumors in mice.
We had this situation where the company initially seemed to be responsive to the concerns, and they actually sent a team of researchers to Dr. Olney's laboratory. And they recreated the studies. The Searle investigators recreated the studies that showed this brain damage in animals. And they went back to Searle, and we waited to hear what Searle was going to do about this. And the next thing we knew, I would say that they probably went to Dr. Olney's lab mid-71. Mid-73, they applied to the FDA for a food additive petition to use NutraSweet as a sweetener. So I called the FDA and I said, this doesn't make any sense.
Dr. Olney was asked by G.D. Searle to conduct a study because there were some concerns. And it's interesting to note that these concerns came up before a lot of the major testing into the toxicity of aspartame became apparent. But my thinking as an FDA investigator is that G.D. Searle already knew that going into this.
Ultimately, FDA, using its good offices, interestingly enough, a major person there, created a meeting between me, Searle, and General Foods, which was going to be one of the main customers. And we met. And I said I didn't think that this would ever reach the market. And they said, well, they were sure it was going to be approved. And I thought that we were on 180 degrees opposite sides. It turned out that it was approved, but FDA asked them not to market it. And they held it up so that there could be hearings and so forth.
In 1974, the FDA approved the limited use of aspartame.
Do you know why they were sure it was going to be approved? You said that they said that it was sure that it was.
Well, see, when I said I don't think it's going to reach the market, I was being very particular, but I didn't believe it was going to be approved because the evidence didn't show. They said it was. Now, one very strange fact in all of that is that I knew that they had the brain damage study from Olney's lab that their own people had done. And we talked about the various pieces of evidence that were problems. And I finally said, what about the brain damage problem from the animals in Dr. Olney's laboratory that your own people have gone and looked at? And he said, we don't think those are going to be a problem. Well, it turned out they weren't a problem because they didn't give them to the FDA. So here they had in their own files a study that raised very serious questions which they did not give to the FDA. That's a violation of law.
G.D. Searle did not inform the FDA of this study until after aspartame's approval. This approval came despite the fact that FDA scientists found serious deficiencies in all tests related to genetic damage.
And so all these concerns were all rolling around inside FDA, and they were trying to organize them into a policy. And every time they would organize them into a policy at the bench and science level, and they would go up one level to where the policy people were, the policy people would overrule them.
A month later, Olney and Turner filed a formal objection stating that they believed aspartame could cause brain damage.
But anyway, we filed our petition. Dr. Olney filed one and I filed one attacking the approval. And the FDA said, right, there are some factual information that we should look into. We'll have a public hearing.
Only because some of the investigators working for the Food and Drug Administration, looking at this data, knew that the data did not contain adequate safety information about aspartame.
In 1975, due to serious questions over the quality and validity of G.D. Searle's testing of aspartame and other pharmaceuticals, the FDA formed a special task force to examine 11 of the pivotal studies on aspartame. Pivotal studies are those upon which the FDA bases approval or disapproval. Of the 113 studies done on aspartame submitted to the FDA by Searle, 90 were conducted in the early to mid-1970s. Every test the FDA called pivotal was part of this 90. In March of 1976, the FDA completed their 500-page report after finishing their investigation.
The report by the FDA team that inspected it is the most devastating report about research that has probably ever been written about a specific company. And that led to a series of hearings in Congress and came up with a $12 million appropriation to FDA to enforce good laboratory practices. But what happened is there's a policy resolution, but NutraSweet and Cyril got bypassed in the sense that they took this all over here and said, look at this terrible thing that's going on. There were a couple others that were going on at the same time. We've got to do something, and they did something. What they did was, going forward, you have to meet these requirements. They didn't do anything about going backwards and saying, look, the stuff you came through here is killing people. Now, the reason they didn't do that at the time, because that happened in 75 and 76, is that it was the assumption of everyone in the process that the FDA was going to handle it. So FDA, one of the things FDA did that was so striking and remarkable is that they, knowing that they had this terrible situation on their hands, hired a group of pathologists. It's a pathology research group. FDA hired them to review the Cyril studies, but had Cyril pay for it. So the result was, here's a company which makes its money by being hired and paid for to do studies. Well, why would it do a study that was going to be critical of NutraSweet?
In 1977, the FDA Chief Counsel, Richard Merrill, recommended to U.S. Attorney Samuel Skinner that a grand jury be set up to investigate G.D. Searle.
Well, FDA did attempt to do something, and it wasn't the political part of the FDA. These were the people that really were trying to work and do well. One of the counsels, lawyers for the Food and Drug Administration, contacted the U.S. Attorney in Chicago and to bring an indictment against G.D. Searle for fraud, for deletion of records, manipulation of records, the falsification of records, and a number of other things on the testing that they did on aspartame and several other products as well.
Suddenly, U.S. Attorney Samuel Skinner began preliminary employment discussions with G.D. Searle's law firm, Sidley and Austin. The U.S. Justice Department urged Attorney Samuel Skinner to proceed with the grand jury, pointing out that the statute of limitations on prosecution would soon run out. Samuel Skinner withdrew from the G.D. Searle case, and Assistant U.S. Attorney William Conlin was assigned to the grand jury investigation. Shortly afterwards, Samuel Skinner left his job to work for G.D. Searle's law firm. The assistant he left behind let the statute of limitations run out on the aspartame charges. This assistant, William Conlin, was hired 15 months later by G.D. Searle's law firm, Sidley and Austin.
The common denominator for all of this, unfortunately, is money. And the amount of money that was flashed around induced people to drop the lawsuit against G.D. Searle and come work for the very firm that they were going to try for illegal activity. And that's what happened with the U.S. Attorney. That's what happened with several people working for the Food and Drug Administration at that time. If they passed aspartame, literally, they were promised great jobs when they finished with FDA.
And it was interesting, the main guy that made the decisions that overruled them in the Bureau of Foods went on to work for the Soft Drink Association. And actually 7 of the key people that made decisions that kept NutraSweet moving through the process ended up working for one or another NutraSweet using industry. That's kind of an interesting side effect to the whole thing.
I like to do well at things. It's important to me that if you're given an assignment that you try to do it the best you can. I'm afraid that some people confuse that with some sort of single-mindedness on my part.
Donald Rumsfeld went into the company after he left Washington, after Ford lost, and that would be in 1977. Is in business, and he was the congressman from there. And then he went to the White House, where he was White House Chief of Staff, and then he became the Secretary of Defense. And he's involved in a whole group of people around Chicago that are they're involved in a whole range of things, national security being one of them. He was also part of the RAND Corporation, one of the major defense think tanks. He's a very bright guy, like in the best and the brightest, the kind of people that brought us Vietnam. These are people who believe that thinking is the primary way that you get through life, having values, feelings, and so forth. They denigrate. So he took over this company, and it was going down the tubes completely. It had FDA investigations. It had grand jury investigations. It was losing money. Its stock was down. A person was hired to come in and explain why the FDA was so down on them, and went through all of their records and said, "You guys haven't got a chance. This company is a mess, a total mess." And he went in with a full team of politicians. He went in with himself, a politician. He brought his special assistant, who was a Republican Party operative, worked with the Republican National Committee, brought in a press guy from there, brought in lawyers, and they took on the issue of this company as a political issue. And one of the first things that not first, but somewhere in that first year, it was late in the year, he called me and said, "Let's have a meeting." So I went and I met with him. We flew into the Madison Hotel and we met and we talked. And my point was that the struggle that was going on around NutraSweet was a scientific struggle. We needed to know the scientific answers. And this was before the Public Court of Inquiry had ruled. We needed to know the answers. So why don't we, the people who were raising all of the questions about NutraSweet and the company, together create a set of protocols that we would agree address the serious questions that needed to be looked at to decide whether or not it should be marketed. So we had this meeting. And for about 6 months, his staff and I and our group negotiated out how we could proceed on this. His own scientists didn't want to do it. For example, at the time that they put their evidence into FDA in 1973, there were no requirements at FDA to examine effects on the brain from food additives. No requirements whatsoever. So there never was a study done to look at whether or not this affected the brain in a neurological sense. The cancer studies were incidental. Those were cancer studies. But these were not brain studies. The cancer studies turned up brain tumors. But they didn't look, for example, at these holes in the brain or mental retardation or lowering the ability of people to think or causing dizziness or blindness or any of those things. None of that was looked at. And we were proposing that we design some studies to look at it. And that was the direction I thought we should go. And I should say that at that point, I was involved with a group of people from the food industry. We had created something called the Food Safety Council. We had 35 major corporations, and it had a board that was half corporate people and half consumer advocates, academic people, environmentalists, and so forth, to look at the standards for food safety. And we had written a whole series of standards for food safety. Basically, what I was saying to Rumsfeld is, why don't you bring your company into the same framework that all these other companies have agreed to be a part of? And we had a very good, very full and frank exchange. His scientists kept jumping up and running around the room and saying, "There's no problem, there's no problem, there's no problem." Ultimately, he made the decision not to find out what the facts were, but to move forward on the limited record that they had before them. And I believe it was a decision that was made that said we can accomplish our ends better legally and politically than we can by actually doing the science to determine the outcome of the questions that are being asked. And in my mind, that demonstrated that he was an individual not interested in facts, not interested in the truth, not interested in finding out what the fundamental realities are, but much, much more interested in setting a goal and then by will and force pulling all the resources that he could possibly pull together to achieve that goal, i.e. get NutraSweet on the market and sold.
And so Donald Rumsfeld had been in all these meetings and known all of these potentially very harmful effects of this substance that he then went on and continued to market?
Well, I can't say what Donald Rumsfeld knew or didn't know. He's not a scientist. He's not very interested in science, from what I can tell. More or less, he's a fixer. He's an operative. You assign him a job and he goes and he does it. Now, I'm sure that as he gets up into the level of Defense Department, he sort of makes up his own jobs and says, "I'm going to do these things." But facts are not all that important to how he proceeds, because he's so confident that he knows what the outcome should be that he will look across, at least in the way he did on NutraSweet, he looked across the horizon to find all those facts that would support his position and then minimized or denigrated all the facts that didn't support his position.
In 1980, the Public Board of Inquiry voted unanimously to reject the use of aspartame until additional studies could be done on aspartame's potential to cause brain tumors.
the product was said not to be, it was ruled by law, it was said you cannot market this product. And then they had to go and do political triage and get in there and manipulate the process. So, I mean, the manipulation was so powerful that one of the first things that Ronald Reagan did when he became president was suspend the authority of the FDA commissioner to take any actions. So he was sworn in whatever day in January, and the next day he issued an executive order eliminating the FDA commissioner's authority to take actions. There was obviously a fear on the part of somebody that the commissioner was going to do something about NutraSweet or something else that would create difficulty, because it took him a while to get a new commissioner. It took him a little over a month to get a new commissioner, get the old one out and the new one in. And in that month, the old commissioner was prevented from taking any actions by an executive order. And that takes a high level of political clout to do that. But that's political triage on a situation that had gone sour because Rumsfeld had made the decision to just power his way through and ignore getting the facts.
In 1981, the day after Ronald Reagan took office as U.S. President, G.D. Searle reapplied for the approval of aspartame. Several new studies were submitted along with their application. 3 of the 5 FDA scientists responsible